Hello, welcome, and a special warm welcome to Ambassador Andreas Mavroyiannis, who's our guest lecturer for today. We are now in the second week of the Academy. The topic for the week is international peace and security. And dear Andreas, the Ambassador Mavroyiannis, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. We are very grateful that you've accepted our invitation to be part of the CIL eAcademy and to speak to us about the important issue of peace and security, where I have to say you have a long experience, not only as an academic, but also as a practitioner, since you've been a career diplomat, ambassador of Cyprus to numerous important positions, including, of course, not only a permanent representative for Cyprus at the EU in Brussels, but also the permanent representative of Cyprus at the United Nations in New York. You're also an esteemed academic who has combined practical life with academia, and you're teaching now in Cyprus. And I think above all, let me also welcome you as a colleague, as a member of the International Law Commission, where we have the pleasure to serve together since this year. So, yeah, Andreas, a warm welcome to you on behalf of Nilofer and myself and of the CIL. And we look forward to your talk, and then also to have some time for a discussion at the end with our participants. So, Andreas, again, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you today. I say hello to all the people that are viewing us and listening to us. It's the first time I'm in touch with you, but you know, as somehow a failed academic, I'm coming back to the scene of the crime. I started as an academic, then I went to diplomacy, and now, after having retired from diplomacy, from politics, from many things, I try to touch base again with the fundamentals. And I'm very, very happy to be able to be with you today. Patricia, our chairperson of the International Law Commission, it's really, really a great honor for me, a humble member, to be able to participate to a session with you. And I, more as a practitioner and as a diplomat, I will try in the few minutes I have in front of me to give you a very brief outline of how I see myself, if you like, based on this long experience, this fundamental question of international peace and security, or as somebody a bit nasty would say, the lack thereof to some extent. So it is for me, if you like, a moment of also of personal reflections on where do we come from and where do we go in terms of preserving and restoring international peace and security. The fundamental idea and the dream of humanity throughout history is, as a motto, recent motto was going, peace at home and peace in the world. How many thinkers, philosophers and preachers have dedicated their thinking on how we can have what they were calling perpetual peace, which would allow humanity to thrive? How do we put in place a permanent and just peace and security between communities in the past? and in recent centuries between powers, between states. This vision about what needs to be done is quintessential for human civilization, in particular in modern times, where communication, interaction, globalization render interdependence and the need for cooperation, peaceful coexistence, and good neighborly relations the prerequisites for achieving a better world. We all know from experience that this idea has always been and remains somehow elusive. It is more a kind of an ideal Cuban, the notion used by the German sociologist Max Weber, rather than, a tangible and existing perfect state of affairs. Still, we understand the necessity through an Aristotelian teleological approach to define the sought-after result and to set in motion the process and the means that would allow us to progressively reach this aim. It is important to insist on this because here the process, the means and the contents are as significant as the results. We are not in a situation where the aim justifies the means. There can be, very well, and we have seen this in history with totalitarian regimes, that you can't have the peace of the cemetery. And we have seen in the 20th century with 2 world wars. It can be the peace of total dominance by somebody, or by an empire, or any kind of totalitarian system. International peace and security we are talking about is about a system that is respecting human rights, democratic accountability, international law, and the sovereign equality of states, and can only be achieved in our world today through an effective system with the United Nations at its center. The ongoing crisis of multilateralism and the prevalence either of unilateralism or a kind of directoire of some powers, or what we have seen in parallel to the system of the United Nations since the Second World War, i.e., a situation which is also based on the balance of terror and the doctrine of the guaranteed mutual destruction, are certainly not what we are talking about and what we want to achieve. So very frequently, and in the abstract, not wrongly, I would say, that people very easily criticize international law and international organizations and the vectors of institutionalized international cooperation as quasi-irrelevant. We all hear often aphorisms like, it's all about interests, it is the law of the jungle, double standards, etc., etc. My intention here is not to enter into an argument with these assertions. I'm just told that in the face of such appalling picture, we shouldn't ignore that the principal mitigating factors to the rule of the might, to the rule of the force in international relations and in the international scene overall are international law and international organizations, the institutionalized international community. Are they perfect? Of course not. Have they important limitations? Of course. This is what we're trying to see a little bit in this short presentation. After the First World War, the peace treaties of 1919 and 1920 established the League of Nations. This new international organization was tasked with three old missions: disarmament, collective security, peaceful settlement of disputes. It was given the possibility to decide unanimously on issues pertaining to the maintenance of international peace. Articles 12, 13, 15 provide for a kind of regulation of the use of force. It asks for a cooling period for 3 months, and if a dispute is referred to the Council of the League of Nations or the Permanent Court of International Justice or to arbitration, countries shouldn't resort to war before 3 months elapse. But there was not a definite prohibition of use of force, but only some kind of a freeze. During the time of the life of the League of Nations, we had the attack in Manchuria, China and Manchuria by Japan in 1932, and we had all the other aggressions that took place even before we entered the Second World War. There was not a real system who collectively face the violation of the Pact of the League of Nations or imposition of sanctions. There were efforts. The Pact Brian Kellogg of 1928 for the prohibition of war, but it was not at all successful. We had a continuation of violence in international relations. But the League of Nations was, however, and indeed, the first world organization with permanency and had as a general objective the development of international relations and the implementation of the rules that have been agreed. Because, as we were saying, it was not successful within the broader political context it operated to prevent the path towards the Second World War. There were, on the side of the efforts of the League of Nations, there were other efforts, and there was also a particular effort to tackle the social dimension of the root causes of war, and this took the shape at the time of ILO, International Labour Organization. In order to tackle the social dimension, shouldn't forget that it was after the October Revolution, and there was a concern that if we want to avoid to have in place such conditions that will give rise to international conflicts, it was not enough just to have pacts between states in order to avoid war or rules, but we needed to start tackling the root causes. And this is what we're going to see that happened after the Second World War through a more comprehensive approach. So after this first effort, real effort, there were, of course, in the past, you can mention the Westphalia Agreement of 1648. You can talk about the Vienna Conference of 1815, but those efforts were not about ensuring peace and security. It were about some kind of directoire, ensure the perpetuation of the situation with the power game as it was at the time, and it was not something that would be the vector for real international peace. Of course, there were in parallel other efforts. There were the Hague meetings, the conferences of 1899 and 1907. This time, in order to bring a minimum of regulation in the war, the laws of the war. How can we make, not necessarily avoid going into war, but address some of the fundamental issues that have to do with the use of particular weapons? How do you conduct operations, etc.? There are many things about this. Of course, this goes well beyond the scope of what we're talking here today. But this is to tell you that we had then, the Second World War, and we all know what happened. During the Second World War, there were several proclamations, the Atlantic Charter, the Declaration Roosevelt-Churchill, the statement Roosevelt-Churchill-Stalin in Moscow in 1943, the Declaration of the United Nations in Washington in January 42, etc. Somehow, in parallel with the war effort of the Allies, there was a commitment to found a peaceful and democratically organized international community in order to ensure peace in the world after the end of the Second World War. So the United Nations, created in 1945, was the incarnation of what we were all saying at the time: never again. We cannot allow this to happen again in world affairs. So the UN was also, as a system, considered the realization in practice of the idea of the organization of the global international society, if you like. And it was a complex system as evolved slowly. We had the United Nations organization per se, but slowly, we had a very complex network of relations that it maintains with a variety of specialized agencies and organizations that are part of the system, and of course, programs and organs and a lot of things that are happening around and which constitute today what we call the UN system. And this is the UN family. So not all organs and organizations have a mission concerning directly international peace and security. It's more the political organs of the UN. But as I was saying earlier, drawing from what happened at the time of the League of Nations, we knew, and this was the approach, that we need, beyond tackling, if you like, peace and security directly and per se, we need to address also the root causes. And this is what the system aims. We will try a little bit to understand better the structure and the functioning of the United Nations with this idea in mind, the system, and what functions are fulfilling in international relations, both institutionally and functionally. Of course, we need to place the United Nations within the historical and political context within which it operates. And we need also to understand, the limits of the action of the UN. And we need to pay particular attention to not only political activities, but have in mind that in parallel, we have all the other tasks and in particular development. I will say a couple of words on this later on. But if you ask somebody today, what is the UN doing? They will tell you, and it's already somehow in the charter, maintain international peace and security and restore it, protect human rights, deliver humanitarian aid, support sustainable development and climate change, and to say a word about our own onions, uphold international law. Upholding international law is also very, very important. So the commitment undertaken by the UN members concerning the peaceful settlement of international disputes are only a piece of the system of the maintenance of international peace and security established by the Charter. In other words, the peaceful settlement of disputes is considered by the Charter as being primarily an issue for the states themselves. The organization does not have as a vocation to meddle with this, except in last instance, if the states have failed, and if their failure endangers peace, or if there is a potential risk and the United Nations is seized of the matter. There is, as I was saying, a constant dialectical relationship in order to achieve peace and security. We need to address the conflicts, but also to address, as I was saying, the root causes that provoke the opposite state, of course. At the end of the day, we know that only international peace and security can ensure real development, progress, eradication of poverty and epidemics, protect the environment and the resources, and create conditions of fruitful cooperation. So one helps the other. Addressing the root causes helps international peace and security. Working on international peace and security helps addressing the root causes. So the UN developed in both directions. If you take the Charter, you will see that in the preamble, it talks about the need to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and many other things that show which is the priority of the Charter and what the system entails. Article 1 talks about the main objective, which is to maintain international peace and security. And in Article 2, we have, for the first time in history, in Article 2, paragraph 4, the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions of self-defense, individual and collective, when force is exercised under the mandate by the Security Council. But fundamentally, we have a prohibition of use of force. The corollary of this is that the Charter establishes, in order to ensure that the prohibition of use of force is in place, a system of collective security under the Charter. And this is what we are going to see in a couple of minutes. But the system of collective security is spelled out very clearly in the Charter, but already there, within the system, there are some important limitations. And the main limitation I want you to be aware of is that the system was not devised to cover all situations because it was the product of the big powers that won the war, and they reserved a special place for themselves through the status they have as permanent members of the Security Council, the right of veto, some other specific rights that they have also a veto when it comes to having amendments of the Charter and many other things. But fundamentally, what this means is that every one of the big five can decide to keep out of the scope of collective security an issue which is of fundamental issue for this power itself. So the framework of collective security is about all the rest. When there were efforts to go beyond, we didn't succeed. There were, of course, something also very, very important that helped also a lot. The ambition of the system was not and is not to monopolize the tools and the international instruments for achieving the goals fixed by the Charter. From its inception, the Charter was based on the idea of synergy, complementarity, and functional cooperation, uniting forces and efforts to achieve results in the field of the provisions of peace and security per se. It leaves ample space to regional arrangements and other instruments, including in the field of self-defense and individual and collective security. NATO and other similar organizations that might exist or existed in the past are considered as particular expression of these provisions of the Charter of Article 51 on collective self-defense. So the United Nations is not the only player, but rather an engine and the catalyst for international peace and security. How the system works, if you take the Charter, you are going to see that there is a presentation of the aims first. Then we're talking about the competences of the General Assembly, including in the field of international peace and security and the adjustment of the situations. And then we go to the Security Council, which is entrusted with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. Chapter 6 starts by mentioning the means of peaceful settlement of disputes, and then it goes crescendo. So I think you have seen already these things in other lectures, so I will not say much, but I want you to understand something important. There is no general obligation in the Charter to settle international disputes. The obligation contained in the Charter is to settle the disputes in order to avoid putting at risk international peace and security. So if two states do not want to settle a dispute, but They are not going to go into war. They are not going to threaten each other. And they just have it lingering. It's not of the interest of the UN. The UN gets involved only if there is this dimension. And you're going to see that there is this mention of the tools in 33. Then there is the right of states to have a recourse. And then there will be later on in the following articles how the Security Council is dealing with this, and that the Security Council can advise and offer not mandatory, appropriate procedures. And then if the parties to a dispute do not manage, then the Security Council can even propose under Article 37 terms of settlement that the Council considers appropriate. So, and then, as I was saying, we're going crescendo. What happens if still there is a threat and to peace, and there is a breach of peace or acts of aggression? Then we have Chapter 7, which we all consider as the magic chapter, which allows the Council to take action in order to restore international peace and security, provisional measures. And then if you read all the Chapter 7, you will find a whole system that was devised, and including making forces available to the Security Council, having a military staff committee, etc., etc. Unfortunately, this system never worked. Military staff committee was never set up. Forces were never made available to the Security Council. And so in practice, things happened differently. We had a few first operations in the late 40s, including one in between Palestine and Israel. But later on, we had the Korean War, the aggression by North Korea of South Korea, and we had a resolution of the Security Council creating the conditions for a military operation in Korea. But we need to bear in mind that this was possible because Soviet Union was not at the time participating in the Security Council. It was protesting the fact that China was represented by Taiwan. This is how it became possible. Later on, when Russia rejoined, Soviet Union rejoined, the Security Council was blocked. And this is why we had the system of uniting for peace, Resolution 377, where when the Security Council was not able to act, we had the intervention of the General Assembly to take over and do the work on behalf of the UN. Then we had in 1956 the operation in Suez, which was mandated for the first time by a General Assembly resolution and not the Security Council. And then we had the situation in Congo, which went at the end beyond the ordinary mandate concerning the use of force by the peacekeeping force, if you like. But then we found out that the system almost collapsed. And so what was put in place later on were what we call today peacekeeping operations, which are based on the consent of the host state, and they try to help the host states come in control of the situation and help restoring peace and security. You know that we had, today I think we have 61 completed missions of the United Nations, and we have 12 ongoing missions. Some of them were successful, some of them less successful, but still they were important. Those were in parallel, as I was saying, to the work of the UN on other issues, not only development, environment, poverty, etc., but also we all know how instrumental were the UN in tackling apartheid in South Africa, in having a withdrawal of South Africa from Namibia. And in the 90s, we had the agenda for peace with 4 pillars concerning peace and security, starting with preventing diplomacy, trying to do our utmost to avoid conflict, then having peacekeeping, the traditional way we're talking about peacekeeping. We had peacemaking, and finally, peace building, which is the most fundamental, because peace needs to be built upon. And the only way is addressing peace building contains also the other dimensions, if you like. So, and in order exactly to address the other dimensions, we had in the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals that, eradicate poverty, promote primary education, gender equality, reduce child mortality, maternal health, combat AIDS and other diseases, environmental sustainability, global partnership for development, etc., etc. The record of this is quite uneven, if you like. The results were quite uneven. And then in 2015, we had the Sustainable Development Goals adopted as part of the Agenda 2030. We have 17 goals and 169 targets. And of course, we are working on this. In a real world, we see what is happening around. This year was not immune, as the last couple of years with the war and the Russian aggression to Ukraine. We see what we have now in Gaza and the attacks of Hamas in Israel, all those things that make us understand that it's not easy. But can we say that the system produces nothing? Okay, an honest assessment, if you like, would tell us that, okay, the glass is half full or half empty, as you like, but there is real content. And the work of the United Nations has helped a lot, not to mention all these things is, we don't have time to talk about this. The United Nations accompanying decolonization, this right of self-determination, friendly relations. We had even in 1982, the Manila Declaration of Peaceful Settlement of Disputes. We all know that the system works. We all know that the International Court of Justice uses a lot, is used a lot by member states in order to tackle, if you like, disputes. We had an incredible amount of international conventions in all areas. Not in particular, I would like to mention the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is fundamental for international relations today. And we have so many disputes, and we have the tools to address them peacefully. So it's never ending. And, I could speak about this for days, from mainly my experience at the UN, working on a daily basis on various facets of this effort. I had also the honor to participate in many international conferences. I had the honor to be the special rapporteur of the third international conference of financing for development in Addis Ababa in 2015. I chaired the fifth committee of the General Assembly dealing with financial and budgetary issues and all the issues pertaining to setting in place the tools that are necessary. And I know that this is an ongoing and constant effort. Of course, there is not much you can do in very difficult situations. I mentioned the limitations of the system when a permanent member is involved, as we have seen in Ukraine. So the UN was forced and compelled to do mainly humanitarian work in the beginning and try wherever to mediate for some specific tasks. But slowly, we're catching up, and we always try to have the high moral ground in order to mitigate this, as I was saying in the beginning, this power relationship. Same here. Now we had these atrocious attacks by Hamas, which unconditionally we have to condemn. At the same time, in order to preserve the prospects of peace, we need to make sure that there is respect of the fundamental rules of international law for armed conflict, for international humanitarian law, and avoid to all extent possible what we have seen with Hamas, these crimes against humanity, killing civilians, just like that. And please do understand that the best way to keep the high moral ground is to avoid this tendency to give justifications. You might have a lot of explanations. We all know how things developed, etc. But one does not excuse the other. You know, whataboutism in international relations is the worst thing you can do. You need unconditionally stand with the people that suffer. And in order to be able to have this voice of wisdom and be able to promote international peace and security, you need to avoid taking an approach that at the end of the day can justify the use of force either by states, as it was in the past, etc., or these asymmetrical threats by groups that are not states, but they do attack states. And at least we need to have a situation, what we call in international law, belligerency, which means that we need to find ways to respect minimum rules. So that's it. It's 11:50. I have exhausted my 41 minutes. And now I would like you please to ask me all the questions you want to ask. As I was saying earlier to Patricia, its questions are easy, answers are more complicated. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and thank you for highlighting the history and the background. I think that's very important because it's very important to have that, and a lot of our participants are from a younger generation, but to have that background to understand where we come from and to better understand where we may go, and of course your presentation reflects very much your personal experience also in terms of the need to support the UN and multilateralism even in difficult times and upholding international law. And I think that's what we're trying to do together as a collective. And I think those words are very important. When you were speaking, I was thinking, yeah, it's really indeed about seeing the glass half full and the glass half empty, which is something that you said precisely. And of course, one has to be realistic also and say indeed it's been a mixed balance overall, but it is what we have, and I think we have to keep the multilateralist approach alive as much as possible, even though there are clear difficulties. But there are alternatives that you also mentioned, including the role of the General Assembly or the role of the International Court of Justice when we're dealing with issues of international peace and security, in spite of the primary role that the Charter ascribes to the Security Council. So thank you very much for this excellent overview, and also your personal thoughts that come from the experience of a practitioner who's been also involved in peace processes, including in your own country. So let's open now the floor to participants, and I'm monitoring with the help of Teresa, we're monitoring the Q&A box, but please do feel free also to raise your hand and turn on your mic or your camera if you have questions for Ambassador Mavroyiannis. Okay, so we have one in the chat that that I will read. I mean, there are some students who we know have more difficulties in having a good Wi-Fi connection, so it might be more convenient to ask by chat. So there's a question from Mr. Ajema from Ethiopia asking what is the implication of the uni or multipolar system on international peace and security, especially from the perspective of the United Nations. So interesting question, since we're probably now passing from a unipolar system to a multipolar system, and the impacts for international peace and security, and in particular for the effectiveness of the United Nations. So since there's no more questions at the moment, I'll give the floor immediately back to you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and I thank you, Mr. Ajema Meledadadi. This is a very fundamental question. As Patricia just mentioned, we are talking here about the need to have effective multilateralism. And this is all what is about with the UN system and beyond. You need to consider the system as a constellation of stars revolving around the same system and the same objectives. So when effective multilateralism does not work, there is a lot of centrifugal powers that go around. And are they necessarily forces of evil? No. Sometimes they are, sometimes they might not be. But we are 193 members of the United Nations. In order for all of us to have a contribution and a say and to shape our world and our future, we need to have a say somewhere, somehow, in a unipolar system or a bipolar system, or having this directoire of the peak I was mentioning before. You understand that we don't have a say. And if you don't have a say, it means that eventually we are serving the interest and the whims sometimes of some other powers. In order to have an effective system, you need to have a multilateral system. So we need to promote multilateralism, and this is our ambition as member states of the United Nations. We are aware, as I was saying before, of the limitations. We are aware that sometimes there is not much you can do in some areas, just to mention, and just a very little non-controversial issue today after 60 years. Let's take the Cuba missiles crisis. Was there much the UN could do in the face of this open opposition between the United States and the Soviet Union? Probably not. This is just one. Imagine that we can do many things in 99% of the cases. So we shouldn't underestimate this. And we need to learn from all those experiences and find ways, if you like, for the UN to be in the center. You know, let me tell you something from my own country, I have been the negotiator for the Cyprus problem for 9 years. The only aim in town in the efforts for the settlement of Cyprus problem is the good offices mission of the Secretary General, which is supported by a United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus. Without that, nothing could be, maybe we are not successful yet, but nothing could have even been tried. Therefore, we need to understand the importance to having somewhere, somehow, a recourse and strengthen this multilateral alternative. In a multipolar world, it's easier, but we need to have as much as possible this multipolarity going in the direction of strengthening the UN. This is, for instance, what we are doing. I don't want to appear as, talking about who I am and who Patricia is, but this is what we do in the European Union, where we are a special international organization, but we have as a main aim to strengthen effective multilateralism through the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. So there are a couple of questions still in the chat and the Q&A, but there was also raised hands from Kalanka from Sri Lanka. Please go ahead and ask your question live, and then we'll go back if we have time to the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. It was a great pleasure listening to you all the way from Sri Lanka. My question is like more of a comment and just to get a clarification now, since we do talk about the United Nations now, when it was established in 1948, when we look at the number of countries that were there back then and who took the initiative, and when we look at it from now after 75 years, I mean, is there any discussion on, revisiting the whole structure and just to, think about the modern realities and how much we have evolved, and whether something that was 75 years ago that was established, whether it is still capable of, addressing some of the more crucial issues, especially with the influx of countries that, emerged after the end of the Second World War with the decolonization, and also with new emerging powers like India, Brazil. I mean, are we at that stage, or are we too early to discuss anything of that sort?
Oh, Patricia.
So you said something about easy questions but difficult answers.
No, but it's not difficult. It's not difficult. It is true that what we are doing is that we are revisiting constantly the operation of the system. It's a constant quest to see how can we become more effective, how can we have better results. It is true that the world we are having today is not the world of 75 years ago. And as I was explaining, the system established in the Charter is not the system that we are operating today. And also, even the Chapter 7 of the Charter, which gives the power to the Security Council to take mandatory decisions. It's replaced somehow by a Chapter 6 bis, which is not exactly this, but something else. Bear in mind that today the threats, some of the threats are traditional, some of them are new, but also bear in mind something very important, that we have limited financial means, and the UN has been and is constantly through a crisis, a financial crisis, and member states do not want to assume the financial responsibilities that are entailed. And we need, therefore, to find ways to ensure more synergy and complementarity, to find ways to involve also non-state actors. All the work that has been done by NGOs in the development field, in addressing diseases, etc. There are a lot of things, and we need a constant adjustment, but we need also to be, open-minded. And Patricia will tell you that this is what we're trying also to do as an International Law Commission, to shape, if you like, the framework within which we expect the international community to operate in the coming years. Of course, nothing is easy in international relations, because everything is based on the rule of the sovereign equality of states, members of the United Nations. And this is something which is very dear, and we need to preserve it. So we shouldn't, in the name of being more effective, so-called, because at the end of the day, this is not going to happen, sacrifice the fundamental principles. This is what brings me back to what I was calling in the beginning, the teleological approach, where the aim interests us as much as the means. And the means have to be the ones that are consistent with our values and what we want to achieve. So, of course, there is always much more that has to be done.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I think we've run out of time. There were still a few very interesting questions about the underlying reasons for conflict, about how to better combine the position of state in terms of being self-interested to the multilateral agenda, how to better have more effective international humanitarian law.
Yes.
But I think that we would need another another lecture.
Absolutely, and absolutely. But just one word. I agree with what they said about Timor-Leste. Absolutely, this is how it was. And eventually, after so many years, and we all know what happened before independence, after independence with Indonesia, now at least long time, something happened. And then on the rules of humanitarian law, of course, we need to continue working. Don't forget that in the meantime, we had also some important things that happened. We have now an international criminal court. I mean, legally not part of the UN system, but developed through the UN system, which ensures also some things that are happening. So there are a lot of things, we can talk about the tribunals for Cambodia, for Sierra Leone, for former Yugoslavia, a lot of things we can talk about. So the humanitarian dimension takes also new impetus, and it will take even more if we manage to find ways to have more understandings, including, and there is a long discussion about this, I cannot say much about it, this humanitarian intervention. Again, this is a big chapter. Let's not talk about it. So thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, everybody, for very interesting questions. I hope it was okay for you, not very tiring, and wish you all well in your work and in the following lectures you're going to have.
Thank you so much, Andreas, on behalf of Nilufer, myself, and the CIL eAcademy. Thank you for sharing your time, your experience, and also thank you for leaving us with, based on your experience, an optimist note, which is something that it's very good, given the current circumstances we're living. So, Andreas, again, thank you so much, and thank you to all the participants. Don't forget, we're back tomorrow with Professor Dire Pladi for the end of the session, this week's session on international peace and security. And thanks to all the nice comments that are also coming in the chat now. And see you all, and see you soon, Andreas. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice